Okay. All right. Good afternoon. Sorry for the late start. Waiting for last minute people to arrive or not arrive, as the case may be. But time to get going. So we are in the wonderful world of Noach, because we talked about creation last week and things didn't work out so well. That is to say, people were not embracing the gift that God had given them in such a way as to make the world a better place. Quite the contrary. And so, as we know, the beginning of Noach is all about a flood that wipes away all of humanity and all of the animals on earth, except for those that are with Noah in the ark. Sound reasonable so far? Okay. We've talked about the reasonableness and the literalness of this in previous classes, and I commend anybody to look up on YouTube if they want more, or contact me and I'll be happy to discuss in more detail the literalness or non-literalness of the story itself. But literal or not, we have a story with details that are meant to teach us things. And we're going to look at some of those details. We're going to look at one that maybe you've never even considered as being an important detail before. So glasses on, careful reading as we go through. This is a study in the details. So we are in chapter 8 of the book of Genesis, which is after the flood has stopped and the waters are diminishing. Michael, would you like to read?
Okay.
Thanks for volunteering, or thanks for being volunteered. We're going to go ahead and start from verse 1 we're going to go ahead and start actually from verse 24 in order to get the run-up to the deflooding.
Okay. And when the waters had swelled on the earth 150 days, God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the cattle that went with him in the ark. And God caused a wind to blow across the earth, and the waters subsided. The fountains of the deep and the floodgates of the sky were stopped up, and the rain from the sky was held back. The waters then receded steadily from the earth. At the end of 150 days, the waters diminished, so that in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. The waters went on diminishing until the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the 1st of the month, the tops of the mountains became visible.
Okay, so a little bit of a timeline here, just to make sure we have this this clear, because it's often depicted badly. This is a gradual process of the waters subsiding. Right, so you end up with the ark coming to rest on Ararat, wherever that may be. And yes, I know there are mountain ranges by that name in Turkey, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's the same one. That's a whole other issue. But it comes to rest in the 7th month, and no one gets out of the ark. Right, it's now resting on firm ground. That's what resting on means. But for another 3 months at least, the water goes on diminishing until the tops of other mountains become visible. Right? So that means the no longer floating period of the ark is for 3 months just sitting there on the mountainside. Right? Which is why the question that's going to come later, or come in the next paragraph, should already be on our minds. Didn't Noah go out and stretch his legs? Right? Why does Noah need to check if there's dry land? His boat is resting on it. Because usually people say, Noah sent out a dove to see if the waters had receded. How about if he looked out the window? How about if he just looked around to see? Why is he sending out birds at all to check the land when he can see all around him? And that's going to become more of a focus as we see how the bird survey takes shape. So we've got the 10th month, and the 1st of the month, and then 40 days after, we pick up in verse 6.
At the end of 40 days, Noah opened the window of the ark that he had made and sent out the raven. It went to and fro until the waters had dried up from the earth. Then he sent out the dove, see whether the waters had decreased from the surface of the ground. But the dove could not find a resting place for its foot, and returned to him to the ark, for there was water all over the earth. So putting out his hand, he took it into the ark with him.
All right. What's different between the raven and dove?
The raven didn't come back. It just went to and fro.
Okay, so the phrase "to and fro" is the lovely adaptation of the Hebrew. If you look at the end of verse 7, right, it says "yatzov vashov," right? It goes and comes, right? Coming and going. So it doesn't say it goes to and fro. It says it's going and returning. Right? Shuv is from or shov is from the same root as tshuva for the process of returning. So what you have is the raven. Let's do my best. That's the ark. That's my best boat vision. The raven goes, and the raven comes back, and doesn't seem to do anything it doesn't say, right? It just says it goes out until the waters had dried up. So what's it trying to do? Why send?
It comes and goes, and then one time it doesn't come back because the water's dried up.
Well, it doesn't actually say it doesn't come back. It just says that he sent it out and it went to and fro until the waters had dried up from the earth. So is that saying that when the waters had finally dried, the raven left? And if so, why send out the dove? Why send out a second bird? If we're saying that the raven finally saw the waters had dried up and so it just kept going, why do we need another bird? If it's now signaled by its lack of return that everything's fine,
Just verification.
So send another raven.
And not a dove.
Right? But why send a dove? Right? Why specifically send a raven in the first place is also going to be a question. And then why send a dove afterwards? Is there a difference between these two birds? Could he have sent an eagle? What about a canary, a parrot? Why these birds? And what is the difference? Because if you notice, the raven goes to and from, but the dove doesn't. Right? The dove just says it couldn't find a resting place, and so it comes back. But how could it have not found a resting place? Right? Because we know that this is sitting, there's the mountain, right? This is the mountain. We know that it's sitting on a mountain, hopefully more secure than my drawing would indicate. There's mountain. And we know that way down here, other mountains are now in the 10th month visible above the water. And he's waited another 40 days, which means the water has receded further, which means quite likely from his vantage point up on the mountain, he can see for miles that the water has receded. So what's he waiting for? What's with the birds? It's confusing, right? We just read through this as though it's the most logical thing ever. He's just testing the water, or testing to see if there's water, but he doesn't need to test, he can see. He's got the best vantage view of anything.
Yeah.
What's the bird going to do that he can't? Keep reading.
He waited another 7 days, and again sent out the dove from the ark. The dove came back to him toward evening, and there in its bill was a plucked olive leaf. Then no one knew that the waters had decreased on the earth. He waited still another 7 days and sent the dove forth, and did not return to him anymore.
All right, so it goes out the second time. This time it comes back with a bit of olive leaf, and he waits another week, and then he goes out again, and it doesn't come back. Well, what new information has he gotten? What could he get from this dove that he couldn't see with his own eyes? And what is he waiting for as the signal that it's right to open up the ark and let every animal out?
Because there's vegetation, so that the animals would have something to eat.
All right, so the animals have been fed in the ark. So clearly one of the things he's worried about is when I let the animals out, will they have anything to eat? And he's quite rightly worried that the world, even though it has had the water diminish, is not ready to support the animals in the ark. And so what he's doing with the animals here seems maybe to be testing the waters, so to speak, of whether or not these animals can survive. And that's going to come back as one of the explanations of why he's sending the particular animals that he's sending and the order that he's sending them. All right, but let's finish up with the final part of this.
In the 601st year, in the first month, on the first of the month, the waters began to dry from the earth.
I thought they were already drying and receding, right? What's the difference between drying and receding or decreasing?
And when Noah removed the covering of the ark, he saw that the surface of the ground was drying. And in the second month, on the 27th day of the month, the earth was dry.
All right, so 5 months they've sat on the mountain, not getting out yet. And we've used many different the Torah uses many different versions of what's happening here. The waters are diminishing, the waters are decreasing, the surface is drying. And what essentially is describing here is the process that, living in Florida, we've all come to know and love, which is when there's a huge rain. Pardon for my overlapping artwork. When there's a huge rain, this is the ground, you end up with a layer of water on the top of the ground, right? And that's the second phase. I mean, you end up in certain areas where there's almost a standing lake, and eventually the water recedes until you can see that there's ground, but there's still a layer of water. Sound familiar? Yeah. And then once that water goes away, everything's perfect, right?
The ground's still wet.
The ground is still saturated. So when we get the line that just came here, that the surface was dry, what it's describing, says our commentary, is the fact that Noah could see that the ground was now dry, but he knew the water was still saturating the ground underneath. And he's waiting for it to be really dry so that it's just dirt all the way down, rather than this morass of mud waiting for people to come out.
If you release the animals in this marsh, in effect, they get up.
They wouldn't last too long. And this is something that you can't tell just by looking. And it's something that you would specifically not be able to see so well on a mountain. You know, it's almost a detriment to Noah. If the ark had stayed floating on the water in a lowland area, then it would have only come to rest once all of the lowland ground was dry. But instead, he's stuck up on a mountain. He sees everything getting dry around him much earlier than the ground is getting dry thousands of feet down the mountain below. And so he's trying to make a judgment from where he is of what the real world is like down there, because he knows they're not living on a mountain forever. Mountains are good drainage places, right? The water flows off the mountain real quick. It doesn't flow off down here. And so he is checking from a distance what the real world is like, because he can't tell that just by looking. So needing to send the birds is actually makes a lot of sense. And then verse 15 is going to make it all seem pointless.
And God spoke to Noah, saying, "Come out of the ark, together with your wife, your sons, and your sons' wives. Bring out with you every living thing of all flesh that is with you, birds, animals, and everything that creeps on the earth. Let them swarm on the earth and be fertile and increase on the earth."
All right, so we're going to leave the Torah section for there. Why didn't Noah just wait for the God? Right? Why do all the whole bird thing rather than just saying, you know what, when God wants me to come out of the ark, I'll come out of the ark? He had 7 months worth of patience. Did he really need to do the whole bird thing?
Well, he didn't know that God was going to tell him to come out.
He didn't know that God had orchestrated all of this, had led him into, had helped him build the ark, had got the animals together, but God would wait for Noah to decide all on his own when it was time to come out. Noah, throughout the whole story, is not really a man to take initiative. He kind of does what he's told and doesn't really seem to do much else. So trying to figure out what's going on with the birds is more than just figuring out what's going on with the birds. It's also figuring out a bit more about Noah and a bit more about our own connection to God and the lessons of the story.
This is just so detailed. And the timeline and all the words used for receiving.
And all the other information we would have liked to have had, of like, what was the life like in the ark?
Yeah.
That the Torah doesn't tell us. But the birds, that we get a detailed timeline, and exactly which month everything is happening. That we get a detailed timeline, and exactly how old he was, right? 601st year. He's 601 years old now. That we get. So we have to assume if that detail is there, it's trying to teach us something.
Yeah.
All right. Sforno, Mr. Practical, is going to give us a practical explanation of raven and dove.
Why?
Why the raven is essentially what he's asking.
To find out if the atmosphere had dried out after the tops of the mountains had become visible. Noah wanted to know if the atmosphere in the meanwhile was...
Sorry, atmosphere in the world. Wanted to know if the atmosphere, meanwhile, sorry, that's what it should be.
Okay. Was such that the raven could tolerate it. When it came back, it proved that the atmosphere was not yet dry enough for the raven to tolerate it for any extended period of time.
All right, so implied within Sforno's comment, why the raven? Because it was a hardy bird, right? And the word for raven, the arov, could be another type of vulture. So it may not be just the nice little pet ravens, but even if it was the pet ravens are pretty resilient and certainly very clever animals. And so sending out a raven to check the atmospheric conditions, the sort of raven in the coal mine, rather than a canary, it's sending out a raven to check things, is like sending out a barometer. He's trying to test the atmosphere. And the best way he can do that is to see if the raven can go out, and it's not that there is no dry land, it's whether the air has dried up enough. Because he can see dry land from the mountain, but he doesn't know what the quality of the air, the atmosphere, the overall is good. And if the raven flies down, it could land and it could stay, but if it's uncomfortable with the atmosphere, it's coming back to the ark. And I think
so the atmosphere in the ark is different from the ambient
atmosphere on the mountain, right? Even today, you go up in elevation,
yeah, right.
and
The air's thinner.
The air is thinner. You're going to have a very different atmosphere. The moisture in the air tends to pool in valleys. That's why you get fogs in valleys. And this seems like a very reasonable meteorological explanation. He doesn't have satellite imaging. He doesn't have any other sensors. But he can tell if a raven goes down and the raven's happy, then the air is probably good enough. And if the raven comes back, then the raven doesn't like it down there. It's going to come back where it's more comfortable. So this is just his sensor. He doesn't have a tricorder.
Aren't there many birds that flourish?
Right, Hamek Davar says, well, wait a minute. It's Sforno, nice idea, but...
Aren't there many birds that flourish better than them?
Meaning better than the dove and the raven? It's like, okay, maybe the raven and the dove, well, we're going to get to the dove in a second, are hardy or good, but there are hardier birds, aren't there? Aren't there some rougher, stronger birds or birds that will propagate faster and can make life and can live anywhere under harsh conditions? Why these two? And
where did God give permission to Noah to send them from the ark before the time they would all leave?
why should the raven and dove get first dibs on the world? Right? They get the cut line. And when did God say, send out these birds? Because remember, the dove and the raven are part of the breeding cycle to reestablish the earth. So he's risking them in this process?
It seems, according to the plain reading, that these two were not from the pairs that boarded to repopulate according to God's command. Rather, because before the waters of the flood, some raised ravens and doves.
Right? So what's he saying here? Doves, ravens? Yeah, people kept them. And these were Noah's private ravens and doves. These aren't the ones that showed up.
The breeding pairs.
Exactly, or the 7 of the clean animals. These are not those. These are his pets. So he's sending out the dove and the raven that he already has. They are spare dove and raven, and they are domesticated dove and raven.
It is the practice of the raven that is domesticated that one doesn't send it very far.
Which I've never heard before because I've never domesticated a raven in my life. But Ha'amek Davar says that ravens, yes, you can domesticate them, but these are not birds you send for long flights.
The dove, on the other hand, is taught to carry messages far and to carry things in its mouth.
We all know about carrier pigeons. Remember, the dove is just the type of pigeon.
Thus, when Noah sent the raven, when he saw water all around the ark, it didn't go far, but just went and returned.
Right? When he's still seeing some water down there, he's sending the short distance bird because he's just kind of sort of scouting out in advance. but he's not expecting it to go very far. Unlike.
But the dove, trained to bring things even when sent far, was sent far further.
Right, so Amek Davar says the reason why the dove came second is because Noah was waiting for the water to go down even further so that he could get a further scout sent out. But there's no point sending out a dove, which is a long-range bird, when you know that it's a short-range information you're looking for. So he sends the short-range scout, the raven, until the water recedes even further, and then he sends out his long-range scout.
And the dove didn't go out to test the atmosphere.
Because that was Forno's opinion.
Oh.
That was a different commentator, but the dove was sent out specifically because you could count on it to bring back things better than the raven would. Now, I do have to point out that there are some remarkable videos going around the online about ravens' beak dexterity. So I don't know exactly how much this is 100% true about the raven's capabilities, but
Very smart.
They are incredibly smart. Some of the things I've seen them do is just, wow, that's, yeah, I know.
Problem solving.
And multi-step problem solvers. But the idea that domesticated ravens and doves may have different uses, and that these would have been domesticated pairs or domesticated birds as opposed to the breeding pairs, is a very interesting interpretation that Amek Davar gives. So he's saying use the right tool for the right job. And these animals were essentially tools, and they were set aside specifically for this type of job. These are not ones that come from God, so we don't have to explain why Noah's using them, because he's not interfering with God's command. He's using the spares that he has. All right. But we still got to think, poor raven, being picked on.
Said Reish Lakish, the raven gave Noah a sharp reply, saying, "Your master hates me and you hate me."
Right, so basically when Noah picks up the raven and says, all right, I want you to go off and see what's out there, the raven goes, what? Your master, who's Noah's master? God hates me and you hate me. And the quote for why he believes that God hates ravens?
Of the clean 7, of the unclean 2.
Right, from the earlier packing of the ark, we find out that you get 2 of unclean animals, that is to say ritually, animals that are not ritually acceptable for Judaism. And ravens are among the unclean. So God clearly hates ravens, at least from the raven's point of view. Obviously, clean or unclean doesn't mean worthwhile or worthless. It is a ritual classification. But Reish Lakish is saying the raven might not have really understood that. The raven might have taken it personally. And double it up, Reish Lakish seems to be implying here that, unlike Amek Davar, he doesn't see this as being a spare raven. That there were 2 ravens on the ark. Noah sends 1. Wait, we've got a problem here, as he says.
You hate me, for you exempt the species of which you have 7, and send out a species of which you have only 2. If I should be injured by the prince of heat.
It's a euphemism for heat or cold. It's like, as though one of the forces of heat or cold.
Be injured by the prince of heat or cold. Will the world not end up lacking one species?
Right? It's like, wait a minute.
That makes sense to me.
There's me and my spouse, and there are 14 doves. Why are you picking on me? You got doves to spare. If I go and something bad happens, our species is dead. Right? That's called extinction, Noah. And we weren't put on this ark just so we could die after the flood. We were meant to repopulate. So pick one of the doves. Or maybe you got an ulterior motive.
Or perhaps you need only to make use of my wife. Noah said to him, wicked creature, even sexual relations with one normally permitted to me are presently forbidden. Since it was not permitted to have sexual relations in the ark, it is not an argument.
Is it not?
Is it not an argument a fortiori that I should not desire sexual relations with one who normally is forbidden to me?
Right. So we know that relations were forbidden because no child was born on the ark, right? Because the list of the people who went into the ark and the list of the people who came out of the ark, including all their wives, is the same. So nothing got born, and the only way things don't get born in the ancient world is if you're not doing hanky-panky, because no birth control back then. So Noah is responding to them saying, look, I can't even be with my wife right now. You think I want your wife, the bird? You know, you are, this is bordering on paranoia, Mr. Raven. But it is an interesting reminder that sometimes from our own perspective, things can seem especially bad. That doesn't mean it was meant to be persecutorial. All right. Again, Bereshit Rabbah now, asking the same question a different way.
Why did Noah send out the raven? He had said to himself that the raven is a flesh-eating bird and will most likely find remains of dead animals to feed on. If the bird would return with such remains in its beak, the waters had receded somewhat. The raven returned without anything, so that Noah did not learn anything new. The raven returned to its nest, leaving from time to time to see if the situation outside enabled it to survive. It carried on until the surface dried out.
All right, so why a raven?
Because a raven is a carrion eater.
Because there's a lot of dead things out there. So what animal is most likely to survive in the beginning? An animal that eats the dead. It's a very practical reason for sending a raven as opposed to a dove. Doves are not known for being carrion eaters. But the raven is a perfect scout because it can survive on the remains that have been left behind by the flood.
So if it comes back with, well, it wouldn't come back
It
then. With
would
anything in its beak, because it would stay
to eat if it was sufficiently dry.
Yeah.
And the idea here is that if it wasn't sufficiently dry, it might go down, pick a piece off, and come back with it. And Noah was waiting for it to get the right balance. Now, Radak goes on to say, Bereshit Rabbah.
In Bereshit Rabbah, the way the sages view the fact that the raven was chosen as the experiment by Noah in a different light.
All right, so this is a different reason for why the raven.
The blackness of that bird is paraphrased in Psalms 105:28, where the psalmist writes, "He sent darkness and it became dark." A figure of speech meaning that one pins one's hopes on something black, what is likely to receive darkness in return, i.e. not achieve one's objective.
All right, so this is what's known as the power of a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you expect the worst, if you act pessimistically, which is what's being used here with this metaphor for the darkness of the raven, then you are likely to get a dark outcome. And Noah is sort of testing this again. He's sending out something which is pessimistic. And what does he get back? What he expected. Yeah. A pessimistic, the waters aren't good, the raven comes back, this is not a good situation. And then Noah learned something by experimenting the opposite direction.
Seeing that this mission of the raven had proved totally unproductive after waiting 7 days, Noah sent out a dove. A dove is known to have a well-developed sense of imagination and direction, finding its way back after having flown over a route only once or twice. It knows that it was dispatched for a purpose, that is, to receive some information in return for having been dispatched. Moreover, it is in the character of doves to be attached to their home base so that they can be dependent on to return to their nest.
And indeed, we know that from biblical times onward, people had discovered and used this trait of the dove and pigeon to raise them for message carrying and for lots of other purposes. When you go to Israel, you can still see in many of the different ruins whole banks of little boxes that were the dovecotes, where the doves lived, that were used for all sorts of things. And basically what Radak is saying here, well, what Bereshit Rabbah is saying here, quoted by Radak, is when Noah changed his attitude, when he said, you know what, I'm going to send out a bird that I think can make something happen. I'm going to put the best light forward. I'm not going to put out a pessimistic carrion eater. I'm going to put out an optimistic and creative and intelligent dove. Lo and behold, yeah, just pull the door shut a little bit more. Wow, that's quite noisy. Yeah. Lo and behold, it worked. Right? If you tackle a problem with a sense of optimism and of choosing your best attempt rather than your weakest attempt because you're afraid it'll fail, you are more likely to be met with success. Right? It's what was the name of that book? Fear of Failure. You know, you don't try hard enough because you're afraid you'll fail. And then you fail because you didn't try hard enough, and it only confirms that you thought you would fail. And then why should I try harder? Instead, Noah learned, no, I should try my absolute best because it will probably work. And then it will. And this is really kind of a metaphor for the whole issue of mankind's choice in life, right? If you believe fundamentally the world is dark, the people are sinful and horrible and bad, and it's just going to get destroyed again, you don't make an effort to live a life by the light of Torah, by the light of God, and to do goodness and to do all of that. And guess what? You get usually confirmed. If you live a miserable, depressed, and pessimistic life, believing that the world is mostly bad and fundamentally broken, your life will seem to surround itself with darkness and fundamentally broken people. And on the other hand, if you say, no, I'm not going to live like that. Yes, there are problems, but every problem can be defeated by light. You're sending out your dove. You're going to have a lot more success. And the world's going to seem a lot brighter. And then finally, Radak chimes in from the Talmud.
When we have been told in Shabbat 49 that the wings of the dove are protected, the meaning is that seeing that the doves are being raised as carrier doves, transporting messages attached to its wings, the fact that their owners need them alive is their insurance against being slaughtered prematurely. Noah, in sending out the dove, was therefore convinced that the bird would return to the ark, even if there were places on earth in the meantime where it could make its nest.
All right, so you got to think if you're a bird, and you're a bird that's edible, why come home? Right, why come back to your owner? You come back to roost, and that means he's going to have you for dinner. But if you're useful, more useful alive than dead, that's a great reason to come back. And so that's why Noah could trust that even though he was sending out a dove, which would go off into the night, it would probably come back because it had every reason to come back and expect that life would be fine if it came back, rather than if it came back, it would get eaten. And so too, I think that the Talmud is trying to tell us about you need to make people feel valued as they are. Right? If you want people to come back and to be part of your life, you can't treat them as expendable. You have to make sure they know you like them as they are right now, and no slaughtering happening. And that's what keeps them coming back. Otherwise, why wouldn't it just go find a happier place? Not a dumb bird. All right. Let's get to the year.
Okay. This happened in the 601st year of Noah's life, seeing that the Torah mentions that it was on the first of the first month of that year. Noah's 600th year had been completed on the 30th of Elul, and he had entered his 601st year of his life on the 1st of Tishrei.
All right. Sorry, go ahead and finish the sentence.
Which is the first month of the year.
All right. So what's the 1st of Tishrei also known as? Rosh Hashanah. Right. So the world was judged, and the flood began on Rosh Hashanah, and it finishes on Rosh Hashanah. Right. This is the moment when he is cracking open the ark and coming out. It is a new birth. Remember, Rosh Hashanah is considered the birthday of the world. It is now a birthday again for the world as it returns from the flood.
On the 17th day of the second month, he had completed a full year's stay in the ark. Even though the surface of the earth was dry, in the sense that it was no longer covered by water, it was still too muddy, and the surface was misleading, seeing that beneath the immediate surface it was soft and spongy. It was not yet ready for walking on without risking that one would break through a very thin veneer of dry earth.
As we mentioned before.
This is why God had not yet commanded him to leave the ark until the 27th of that month. At that time, as testified by the word dry, the earth had dried sufficiently to make using it as one's habitat a safe endeavor. Noah did not want to leave the ark until he had been commanded to do so by God. He knew that God would issue such a command, just as he had at the time commanded him to enter the ark.
All right, so why is he sending out the dove and raven? Is it so he knows when to leave?
Yeah.
No, Radak is very clear. Noah knew that God would tell him when it was time. He's interested. He's curious.
So it's just an experiment.
It's an experiment. He wants to know, how is the rest of the world getting on? And that's not just idle, right? Remember, he's up on a mountain here. Wrong pen. He wants to know what's going on in the rest of the world. And that is an important instinct that in many ways he was lacking before the flood began. Right? Noah is often criticized in the Midrashim for not doing more to save and to change the people of his world and the people of his community. He now seems to be interested in going on his own initiative to checking out what's happening. He is showing some interest beyond his little world up on the mountain, that he wants to know what the rest of the world is like. It doesn't matter to him. It's not going to change what he does, because he's waiting for God to tell him when to go. But at least he's curious now. At least he's willing to check the world beyond his limited little boat of safety and security.
So it wouldn't have done for he or his sons to walk out of the ark and explore a little bit?
Well, I don't think they could go very far very easily. I mean, it is advantageous to be able to fly. So I think the birds still have him beat there. And I think that they're worried that, you go down and you get yourself caught in this bog. That's all over. So they're definitely waiting for God's command to go. And they are kind of checking what the world is like, but they're not going to use their own initiative to go out of the ark, but they are using their own initiative to at least check on the rest of the world. And that basic curiosity of wanting to look outside your own little bubble is, I think, a big step forward for Noah. And it's a big step forward, at least partly, to getting us to the point where we stop the cycle that leads to the flood. One of the teachings from the sages before about why the flood came in the first point wasn't because the people were running around and murdering and killing each other, but because the people were fundamentally unconcerned, unsympathetic, and lacking in compassion or empathy with other human beings. Noah, in some ways, was a man of his times, in the sense that he also doesn't exhibit a lot of compassion for the other people. But here, at least, he's beginning to open up to the notion that maybe he should take an interest in what's going on around him, even if it's not changing what he does. And that's a big step forward in the development of our morality as a whole. And perhaps that's one reason why God forswears having to destroy the whole world again, because at least now there may be enough of that attitude that the whole world won't need to be destroyed. Which will leave us with our final statement from Sanhedrin.
Said Rabbi Eliezer, the dove said before the Holy One, blessed be he, may my food be as bitter as an olive leaf, but placed in our hand, and let it not be as sweet as honey, but placed in the hands of mortals.
Right? Well, why would the dove want an olive leaf? And Rabbi Eliezer says, olive leaves are bitter. Well, the dove had everything it needed in the ark, right? It was fed and cared for by Noah and his family. Why would it want an olive leaf? And Rabbi Eliezer says this was an olive leaf that came from, not Rabbi Eliezer, but in Bereshit Rabbah, that comes up at the same midrash, says this was actually an olive leaf taken from the Garden of Eden. And the notion here is the idea of that which was given and created by God. And the idea is to say, better to have bitterness, but to be dependent upon God, than to have sweetness, but be dependent upon other people. And the dove is saying to Noah, basically, thanks for all of the help and all of the food. I'd rather go off and be on my own and eat what God gives me than stay here and be reliant on you. And we see this theme over and over again and throughout the words of the prophets and sages of we put our trust and dependence ultimately in God, even if it means things are a little harder for us, even if it means we have to work harder, even if it means things are a little bit more bitter, rather than being superficially comfortable, but enmeshed and dependent upon people who often are leading us in the wrong direction. It's honest work is much better than comfortable corruption. Might be another way of putting it. Any other questions, comments? All right. So next time it looks like a meaningless detail. Realize this is only the tip of the mountain, iceberg, from our commentaries and sages on the raven and dove, but hopefully at least cracks open a little interest in a broader analysis. Keep reading carefully.